Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Provost for being here today. Good afternoon, students, faculty, members of the community, and our special guests. Welcome to the 2018 Donald Gow Memorial Lecture. My name is Yasmin Musa, and I'm an MPA student here at Queen's, and I'll be your host for this afternoon's talk. Established in 1973, this lectureship honors Donald Gow, the first director of the School of Public Administration. This lecture is an opportunity to hear from a prominent figure in public affairs on topics in Canadian public policy. The title of today's talk is A World That Works for Everyone, and our special guest speaker, Her Honour, the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, will be sharing her insights and reflections gleaned from conversations with Ontarians. I now have the great privilege of introducing our speaker. Her Honour was invested as Ontario's 29th Lieutenant Governor in 2014. Her career includes many senior positions in Canada's public service, including as the Deputy Minister of Culture and Youth for the Government of Saskatchewan and the head of the Atmospheric Environment Service. Throughout this period, she managed several public inquiries and royal commissions. In 1992, she was elected as Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program and Under-Secretary General of the United Nations in Nairobi, Kenya. Upon returning to Canada, she was President and CEO of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization and was later President and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies. In her time as Lieutenant Governor, Her Honour has focused on issues of Ontario in the world and sustainability, including its three interconnected parts: environmental stewardship, inclusive prosperity, and social cohesion. Her Honour is a member of the Order of Ontario and an officer of the Order of Canada and holds 11 honorary degrees. As with previous speaker series events, we will be using Slido to pose questions. And so for those of you who are not familiar, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website, which will be pulled up in a moment, or you can use the Slido app on your phone. And the code for today is MPA 18. So please ask your questions throughout the talk. They'll show up on the screen. And if you don't have your own question, you can still take a moment to upvote questions that you are also interested in. And I'll also be sure to take one or two live questions from the audience. Now, please join me in welcoming Her Honour, the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, to the podium.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Bonjour, bonjour. And Happy New Year. I think it's still early enough in the year to say that. Delightful to also see some old friends and familiar faces in the audience as well. I have the opportunity to come to Kingston relatively frequently, so it's always a pleasure. Let me say also that I want to acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples, recognizing the enduring and ancient presence of Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people in this province, and particularly paying tribute today to the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nations. It's also an honor to have been chosen to contribute to a series of lectures that honors Dr. Gow, the founder of one of the earliest schools of public policy, public administration in this country. And that really doesn't surprise me that Queen's University was in the vanguard many years ago, because it seems to me wherever I go, on whatever topic I happen to be dealing with, members of either the student, faculty, or alumni from Queen's are consistently present. And that, I think, speaks very well for this institution. I think you can be proud of the fact that, that such institutions as this one are fundamental to the civic well-being of the province, indeed of Canada, and certainly make a contribution to the world. I do want to make one comment to begin about schools of public policy, because I think they, in particular, play such an important role. They bring to the institutions of policymaking, whether they be governments or industry or civil society, all of whom make policy of one kind or another, through their research and through the knowledgeable, trained individuals that are developed at the school, they bring a multidisciplinary evidence base to whatever policy question is on the table. But I think schools also train people to understand the objectives and the elements of good governance, the architecture of institutions that actually work and bear some resemblance to the real world, because one of the difficulties, of course, is that in some academic settings, when you think you understand the world and then get out in the dailiness of the stresses of the real world, often there's a disconnect between what you learned and what you actually have to see in practice. And I think the other thing that is important that schools of public policy bring is an understanding of the evolution of changes in approaches to the development of policy and strategy. And I'm thinking here particularly of the way in which now we assume that good public policy is always inclusive, at least at its starting point. And that is something that schools really contribute. Never has it been more important, in my view, to support the development of public legitimacy, trust, and confidence in democratic governance. It's a complex, interdependent, fast-paced world, and a world, unfortunately, in which democracy can be very fragile. And so I think it's the training that you get and the fields in which you bring that newfound knowledge are particularly important. Your MC mentioned that I was asked to choose a title for today's remarks. And let me hasten to say, I'm long past the point of giving formal lectures. So don't consider this a lecture, although I do have to keep somewhat to script. I must say that one of my biggest challenges in this position is that you have to be rigorously, scrupulously non-policy prescriptive. And for a long-time policy wonk, that's a particularly difficult challenge. So that's why I do usually have a script to at least guide me along the way. But the choice of title today really arises from the reflections I have about the very privileged opportunity I've had to interact with so many Ontarians all over the province, but particularly during this past year, 2017. There have been so many insights and moments of inspiration. And it seemed to me that as we're just starting in this first month of the year, named after the Greek god of beginnings and endings, I think it would be useful to reflect on the expressions of pride in community and country that I heard throughout 2017. And hopefully it will be an impetus for some of the important dialogues about the future. For me, 2017 was about celebrating the successes and the milestones of the last 150 years, but as importantly, it's about looking to the future and saying, so what do we do differently? What do we do more of? What do we do better in the years ahead? And many of the conversations that I was privy to were about who we are as Ontarians and also about who we want to be, citizens in a world that works for everyone, and hence the title. The question of where do we go from here in 2018 was front and center when I was actually last here on this campus, last fall for the Lieutenant Governor's Visionaries Prize. That evening, 6 Ontarians presented their compelling ideas about how to better connect Ontarians with policymakers and decision makers. And the civic engagement that they demonstrated was representative, I think, of how truly invested Ontarians are in making this province a better place to live, and how eager people are to actually be a part of the conversation, to be a part of the dialogue. On some of the toughest public policy issues, I've found that people don't expect that their view will always be accepted, but they want to know that they've been a part of learning about it, and they want to know they've been listened to. And it seems to me that's a good basis for a start to public policy. The Visionaries Prize was indeed an enlightening endeavor, but it was only one of the many events that I was fortunate to take part in. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and just pinch myself to be so fortunate to be in this privileged position, because our province is rich in so many ways, and I wish that more of you had the real opportunity to experience the land and its people in its full breadth and depth that I've had the privilege of doing. As the months of 2017 sped by, I actually tried to keep a record of those, particularly Canada 150 events in which I participated. And you'll see those all on our website month by month through the 12 months of the year. They number in the hundreds. And I want to share with you a sampling of some of those hundreds of events. And I do so because I hope it makes you proud of this province, but also of the diversity of things that people are interested in. So just very quickly, first of all, there were some events in 2017 that spoke to our sense of adventure, the outdoors, curiosity, and indeed the courage of some individuals. One of my favorites was the father and son team who piloted their C-150 Global Odyssey helicopter on the first circumpolar navigation. They started and ended in Ontario, a father and son duo. And my favorite of all time, the Canada C3 expedition, a crew of 300 Canadians traveling by icebreaker from coast to coast to coast and connecting with communities and connecting with all of us by digital technology. Both of these expeditions shared with us unique perspectives on the country, examining places and angles that few people ever get to. Crucially, the journeys involved not just crossing large distances along the way, but actually interacting face to face, sharing stories with communities, both central and remote, and in the case of the helicopter adventure, actually raising monies for charitable institutions back home. There were also the celebration of the completion of the very ambitious Trans-Canada Trail, and I did opened one of the last pieces of the trail on Tuesday in Kincardine, which is one piece of the puzzle. But what's so important is that it's important to that community, but it also helps people understand that they're part of something bigger, and that something bigger is this province and this country. And then, of course, I did bio-blitzes and aqua hacking, a number of things that were really focused on people's love of the outdoors and their intent to improve environmental stewardship. Then secondly, there were a category of events that reminded us of the sheer power of the arts, culture, and sports to bring us together, to really bring about social cohesion. So there was the Quilt of Belonging that was displayed in Hamilton, a 120-foot tapestry that was made up of blocks that had been quilted not only by members of First Nations communities, but also representing every ethnic community in Canada, which comes from most countries in the world. And it's absolutely astonishing to have a physical reminder of just how diverse we are as a country. Toronto's Harbourfront Centre was an exhibition called Legacies 150, and it opened a window through digital storytelling into the lives of diverse groups of Canadians. We saw numerous exhibits of community art, 150 Reasons We Love Canada, Family Ties at the Archives of Ontario. And in addition to the visual arts, there were music and dance performances, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra's Canada Mosaic concerts, the National Youth Orchestra traveling for the first time from coast to coast, and some very compelling exhibitions that came about because of the impetus of Canada 150. So the Indigenous life as seen through a very powerful dance performance called Bearing, or the opera, Louis Riel, with all of its contrasting views that were brought to bear, but leading to important conversations that need to be told. And there were many books that were published that contribute to our social history. Canada's greatest storytellers, for example, going back to Indigenous times, and Profiles of Humanitarian Courage, which was a book about the 30 recipients of the Pearson Peace Medal. And I would venture to suggest that many people in Ontario don't know how many of their own citizens have contributed to humanitarian purposes in this way. There were so many community events, festivals, and monuments, thirdly, that looked back then on anniversaries. And so we saw the 50th anniversary of the college system in this province and many, many schools. There were many military moments, the centennial of Vimy Ridge, women in the naval service, the Battle of the Atlantic, and more recently a publication on NATO that really documented Canadian defense over 150 years and beyond. There were reenactments, the reenactment of the opening of the first Parliament in Upper Canada, and there were very poignant recognitions of the role of Indigenous peoples. The celebration of nations that was held in St. Catharines, the unveiling of the First Nations Peace Monument in Thorold, and a very special designation of one of the very few chapels royal outside of the United Kingdom, this one at Massey College. Another relevant anniversary was the centennial of voting rights for many women in Ontario. And that focused us on the history of women, past and present. And in our office, we launched something called Unfinished Business. That's an ongoing series of conversations and events designed to provoke reflection about the voices and visions of women over the next 150 years. One of them actually was something called Changing the Game, Changing the Conversation. And it was created by Coaches Ontario and was focused on changing the experience of coaching in sports. And one of the things I get to do on Saturday is actually attend the graduating class of all of these coaches, some of them coaching some of our Olympic athletes as they head to Korea this almost immediately, I guess in the next 2 weeks. The fourth category of events, I think, were those where there were events that particularly focused on engaging young people, such as yourselves, and looking ahead to the future. So Converge 2017 brought university students to Ottawa from right across the country for important conversations about what kind of Canada we want in the next 50 years. Let's Talk Science organized regional events for hundreds of students from at all age levels, and then a national conference called Canada 2067 to discuss the future of science, learning, and innovation. And the Power of Ideas tour showcased innovation, remarkable story of innovation across this country. Imagine a Canada 2017 was a contest for young people organized by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And finally, collectively, communities learned to talk to each other, illustrating their generosity, compassion, inclusion, and diversity. And those activities ranged all the way from the Walrus Talks that toured across Canada under the heading We Desire a Better Future, Experiences Canada that focused on educational exchanges for children at middle school level, Uprooted, an amazing symposium that was held at the University of Waterloo concerning refugees and resettlement issues. And then gatherings of the Pakistani community, for example, Friends Indeed Canada, or the backyard barbecue organized in Mississauga for the South Asian Canadians. So as I said, that's only a sampling, literally hundreds and hundreds of events. And I really regret that the thing I don't have time to do is to give you a sense of the emotions that each of those events actually elicited. The differences among people, but also the similarities across this province. Very early in my tenure, I realized that Ontarians were somewhat hesitant, perhaps because of their humility, to actually share their remarkable stories. And that's a shame, because such stories expose both our successes and challenges. And as we're still a work in progress, perhaps we would do well to pay much more attention to people's stories. So my office asked the identity question: what makes Ontario, Ontario? And we asked 150 Ontarians, some known and some lesser well known, to contribute short stories, just an extended tweet, 150 words, stories that ended up being both humorous and poignant. And the publication, which my colleague is holding up, 150 stories, we've brought copies for each of you to take away. I do so because in sum, this collection of stories paints a picture of who Ontario is, who Ontarians are. And my bird's eye view as Lieutenant Governor is a rather unique one, because in a nonpartisan way, I get to travel this province, I get to observe what Ontarians really think. And I think there are two major themes running through all of these stories and events, and I think they may well be important for students in public policy to do some thinking about. One of them is the importance of place, and the other is the immigrant story. Place clearly matters to Ontarians. Ontario's terrain, waterways, and ecosystems are all part of our heritage, and they provide in many ways the literal and figurative bedrock for the stories of our lives. For example, in the book, Gary Lipinski, former president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, described venturing to his grandparents' island to hunt, trap, fish, pick berries, and live with and on the land. And the message he was trying to get across was that his story was not only about honoring nature, but also working with nature and what it requires to be self-sufficient and what it provides him to be self-sufficient. And there are many stories of the built environment, community centers, universities, even virtual spaces that enable exchange of ideas and the creation of shared points of reference. The question that arises to me from these stories is, are these communities good places to live and to spend time? Are they opening us up to one another, or are they creating artificial boundaries and echo chambers that actually divide us? Some point to the sharpening of a north-south divide in this province, often fueled by dwindling economic opportunities, interprovincial migration, and a perceived indifference to rural communities. Others in smaller urban centers worry about a burden rather than an opportunity that's created by the new knowledge economy. So we see mid-sized market towns losing young people to larger centers, though the valiant efforts of some communities to reinvent themselves are really very promising. The second theme, the immigrant story. We witness, of course, in Canada that in order to build a society in which we can all achieve our full potential, we need new Canadians. And we're fortunate that people have realized how blessed we really are in this province, and that they want to be a part of this new society and add their voices to the conversation. Perhaps it's trite to say that we view diversity as a strength, but I think some of us fervently believe that. And in this respect, many around the world consider us to be somewhat of a model to the rest of the world. So many of the eloquent stories in the book illustrate our nurturing and caring place in the world. And what frustrates me is that most of you have not heard those stories. So Rahul Singh, for example, who created Global Medic, tells of the rapid response teams that he's conducted 176 plus missions in 60 countries that have been devastated by disaster. So there's a disaster in the Caribbean. The first group of people there with medical supplies, with infrastructure supplies, is Global Medic, and they're usually there within hours. Who knows that in Toronto, out of Ontario, we have that kind of international response capability. Gavin Armstrong, a young person from the University of Guelph, describes a health innovation, Lucky Ironfish, that aims to improve the lives of 1 million families who suffer from iron deficiency around the world. And he aims to do that by 2020, a very simple device that has been created. You all know Senator Hugh Segal. In the book, he describes a visit to Canadian forces in Afghanistan. He was deeply touched when he was asking about a building that was just outside the wire, flying the flag of Afghanistan. And when he asked the guide about the building, he was told that the building had been the Taliban headquarters for the region, a very unhappy place of Sharia law, prisons, and torture. And when he said, "And what is it now?" the answer from this very proud female Canadian Forces person drew herself to full height and said, "Senator, it's a girls' school under protection of the Canadian Forces, sir." Made him so proud, but poignant stories like that we never get to hear about ordinary citizens. Janice Stein's story from the Monk Centre in Toronto of a Toronto subway encounter with a recently arrived young man from Aleppo is so compelling, and I want to quote, "Just then the subway lurched, stopped, and the lights went out. The young man began to tremble. He told me that when he finds himself in a confined, dark space, he returns to the cellar he hid in when Aleppo was bombed. I reached out to hold his hand and reassured him that he was now in Toronto." Some of you may disagree with the focus on Toronto, but setting that aside, he grabbed my hand and held tight to Toronto. These are your neighbors, your fellow Ontarians, and there's so many stories, so many more stories to be told. And yet we know that there is still work to do. Although we've embraced the promise of multiculturalism, prejudice and oppression still exist right here, affecting not only newcomers, but also established communities and populations. So as we begin this new year, I think it's very fitting to ask, how can we best channel the energy that was generated by our collective 2017 experience, maintain the momentum that we've built? Because in many ways, Canada 150 really showed Ontarians at their best. And I'd like to conclude by making two observations then. Don't consider this policy prescription, but two observations. The first one is about reconciliation. Certainly the process of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial were not, for them, Canada 150 was often a bittersweet experience. And speaking as the Queen's representative in Ontario, I recognize the ancient ties that bind the Crown and Indigenous peoples together through treaty making. The respectful learning and thinking that is moving us along the long and difficult path of healing has just begun. At its heart, reconciliation is about living together with a spirit of open-minded and fair collaboration between partners, between full partners. And that leads me to say that the lessons of reconciliation apply to so many relationships. It really invites us to ask questions about to what extent are we prepared to make space for each other, and whether we accept, not simply tolerate, difference. When cultures meet, is there a transformation on the part of one or the other in terms of our identities, who we really become, who we are living in Canada? And the second word, the second observation I'd make relates to the concept of sustainability, a word that is so misused, so misunderstood. It is a concept that's both holistic and interdisciplinary, and it's a word that is absolutely crucial if we're going to become resilient, if we're going to be able to respond to what the future is bringing us. But all too often people think of, when they hear the word sustainability, they think of environment. Perhaps that's because some of the first discussions arose in that context. But in reality, it's so much more. And as your MC suggested, it's really, along with inclusive economic prosperity and social cohesion, it really are the three things that build continued good health in our communities and in our planet. But implementing sustainability as a philosophy and as a practice will involve a paradigm shift. It frames the problem differently. It recognizes our vulnerability and it embraces adaptation to change. For many, it could actually be a rewrite of global problem solving. And I think that's particularly why 2 years ago, the United Nations actually developed a global agenda for 2030 that uses the notion of 17 sustainable development goals as a path forward. So often, I think Canadians and Ontarians don't think about what it means to developing countries, but they don't look at it as a lens for focusing on challenges that are much closer to home. The SDGs are not just for developing countries. They speak to the challenges we face. For example, goal number 1 asks us to end poverty in all of its forms. Did you know that more than 1.7 million people in Ontario live below the poverty line? Goal number 2 calls for zero hunger and the promotion of sustainable agriculture. And did we know in Canada that more than 800,000 people, 1/3 of whom are children, use food banks, have to use food banks every month? And there's so much more on all of the other goals. I certainly am not doing justice to the comprehensiveness of the goals, but I mention them only in passing to point out that this is what the global community has agreed is going to be essential to move us forward, and it's equally a useful framework for action here. Ontarians have not only a lot to contribute to the world, but they also have a lot to learn from the world. It's both an opportunity and an obligation. And in times of fake news and echo chambers, when it's very tempting to turn inwards, I think it's a temptation to isolate ourselves that we must resist. Ontarians, in my experience, are very good at building bridges, and we can lead by example. And so, a final story to end. This one from economist Armin Yalnizyan, and a contribution that she made to Canada's 150 Stories. And I'd like to think that how what she expresses is actually the same kind of thing that most schools of public policy would express. She says, "Why does Ontario matter? In a world squealing with global tensions and careening between thickening borders and borderlessness, all human endeavor is, after all, a story. And every story has a face, a race, and a place. We, the human species, are pack animals, constantly comparing ourselves to one another, constantly seeking champions. Over the last 150 years, Ontario has been evolving toward the peaceable kingdom, the United Nations in action. Looming large in these accomplishments is Ontario's record. 50 years ago, we sang, 'A place to stand, a place to grow.' Today, we are a place to lead towards social, economic, and environmental justice. The world is looking for stories that shine a light on ways to advance inclusive, sustainable growth, and Ontario's example could prove a much-needed beacon of progress in the 21st century. Ontario could matter a lot if we choose. In the coming months, it's to be expected that Canada 150 will fade from our collective consciousness. And in the coming years, some may remark that we didn't leave many sesquicentennial monuments and physical markers as we might have done in the centennial of 1967. So perhaps one way to think about it is that in 2017, Canadians decided to leave our mark in a different way. Canada's now a more mature country, perhaps not feeling the need as much to prove itself. All I can tell you is that the conversations that I've witnessed over the past year reflect values and visions that are actually in harmony with those of our neighbors around this global village. And I hope that a commitment to sustainability, and in the process building a better community, province, and planet, will prove to be a turning point, an historical marker that's greater than any monument, a testament to lasting and positive change. Ontario is a story yet untold in the world, and we're just beginning a transformative intergenerational undertaking, and I thank you in advance for the contribution that I know each of you in this class is going to make to realizing that vision. Merci, miigwech.